In this video, we'll be taking a photographer's look at the new 2018 MacBook Pro with Vega 20 graphics. Hi there, Michael here from VibrantShot. You can find me via the social media links below and also at vibrantshot.com. So in this video, I'll be doing something a little bit different. I wanted to take a look at the latest 2018 MacBook Pro with the Vega 20 graphics and really look at it from a photographer standpoint to see how well it performs for our purposes. Now I'm going to be comparing it to a late 2016 model with the Radeon 460 graphics, which is more or less equivalent to the Radeon 560s found in the base spec of the current 2018s. Now my model is also equipped with 2 terabytes of onboard storage, so I wanted to run some additional comparisons using a few different storage media. I'll be testing out the onboard storage, an external Samsung T3 SSD, and also an external Lacy rugged hard drive. My goal here really is to see, okay, if you're going to buy a new computer as a photographer, where should you be putting your money? Where are you going to get the best bang for your buck? Now my testing is really going to be focused on those repetitive tasks that we do frequently on a day-to-day basis, both in Capture One Pro 12 and Photoshop CC 2019. Now I won't be diving into every single filter that's in here, given that most don't really get used in the real world. For me personally, I use Liquify, Gaussian blur, and high pass filters frequently, and those are already pretty fast, so there aren't too many gains that can be made in there. Now, of course, starting out, one of the things that we do repetitively is importing RAW files into Capture One Pro, and this is one of those processes that can be pretty time consuming. So I'm going to go ahead and run these tests on 250 megapixel phase 1 photos, which we can of course extrapolate to larger file counts as well. Now let's go ahead and get started, and we're going to see how this compares across the various storage media and the 2 machines. So the basis for our import will be the 2018 MacBook Pro using the Samsung T3 external SSD as the write destination. Now, as we're importing these images, a few different things are happening. We're reading the file from our source, be it an SD or a CF card, and copying it to our destination drive, but at the same time, Capture One has to process the raw file and generate a preview along with other metadata in the form of a proxy file. Now, based on my conversations with the people at Phase 1, this is largely a CPU-intensive process, as well as depending on the speed of your read and write media. So the time to perform the import on our 2018 MacBook Pro with the external Samsung SSD was 2 minutes and 35 seconds. And if we switch over to the internal storage, that resulted in a time of 2 minutes and 14 seconds. So about a 21-second savings over the external SSD. Now, if we move over to the external Lacy hard drive, the time skyrockets to 6 minutes and 10 seconds, so almost 3 times longer than what we had using internal storage. Now, if we compare against the 2016 model, we also see a modest gain as the time there rose to 3 minutes and 6 seconds. Now, if I observe the import on the 2016 model, I notice that the majority of our gains came from the faster generation of the preview files, which on the 2018 model largely kept pace with the speed of the import, while on the 2016 model, they required about another 40 seconds following the file import completion in order to finish the generation of the previews. Once imported, I didn't really see any noticeable differences in terms of performance in overall use between both MacBooks or even across the different storage media. Stepping through the image happens smoothly, even using large 100 megapixel files, as does making adjustments to exposure, high dynamic range, color, and things of that nature. The same story can be told for Photoshop when it comes to typical use like zooming in and out, toggling layers, painting masks, and so on. Even with a large number of adjustment layers and this 60 megapixel file, the changes appeared immediately with no lag on either machine. It's possible that as we approach extremely large files with hundreds of adjustment layers, the differences would appear more noticeable, but as far as a fashion or beauty retouch goes, I've loaded this image with far more adjustments than I would ever typically use, and things are still working perfectly for me. Of course, another common operation is to export the prepared RAW file into a TIFF or PSD for further editing in Photoshop. For this test, I used 100 megapixel phase 1 files and exported them into a 16-bit PSD. The time measured for this operation factors in both the work involved in creating the PSD, writing it to disk, as well as opening it in Photoshop. On our 2018 MacBook Pro with the external SSD, this took 9.6 seconds, and with the onboard storage improving things only slightly to 9.4 seconds. Using the external hard drive, we once again see a substantial spike with the time climbing to 19.6 seconds. Over to the 2016 model, the export time was 15.3 seconds, so we get about a 60% gain on the new MacBook. I suspect that the reason for this large improvement is actually related to the Vega 20 graphics card, since PSD and TIFF export in Capture One make use of both the GPU and CPU alone doesn't really explain the gain, since the Coffee Lake i7 in the 2016 MacBook Pro only benchmarks about 20% higher in single-core performance and 40% higher in multi-core versus the i9 Skylake in the 2018 model. Another thing that I wanted to test out was to export not just one PSD, but multiple files to see if we get any different results in an operation that will push the CPU and GPU for a longer period of time. For this test, I exported 6 100 megapixel PSD files and measured the time from the start of the export to the time that they finish opening in Photoshop. Completing this on the 2018 model with the external SSD took 56 seconds, so more or less in line with the 9.6 second export time on the single file test. Using onboard storage, we got a time of 53 seconds, and using the external hard drive took 87 seconds. Where things got interesting is when we moved over to the 2016 model, the same process using the external SSD took a lengthy 106 seconds. This gives us a per file time of nearly 18 seconds versus 15 seconds on the single file test. My guess is that this once again has to do with the graphics card and the Vega 20 generating less heat than the Radeon 460. I found that on the 2018 model, halfway through the process, the fan kicked in at only a lower power and never really peaked throughout, whereas on the 2016 MacBook Pro, the fans kicked in a quarter of the way through and remained high for the duration of the export, suggesting that we may have run into some thermal throttling on that 2016 model. Next up, I moved on to the JPEG export using 40 100 megapixel files, downsampled to 3600px, and exported as high-quality JPEGs. Using the external SSD, this took 3 minutes 4 seconds, 2 minutes 58 seconds with the onboard storage, and 3 minutes 47 seconds with the external hard drive. Once again, we saw a large gain of 52% here against the 2016 model, which took over 4 minutes and 40 seconds to complete the same export. This was fairly interesting since JPEG export relies more on single-core CPU performance rather than multi-core or GPU capabilities, so my expectation was to get about a 20 to 30% improvement in this time and not anything in the neighborhood of the 50% that we saw here. Next up, I tested another time-intensive process, and that is creating a contact sheet within Capture One Pro. For this, I took the same 40 100 megapixel files that we used in the JPEG test and created a 4x4 image contact sheet that spanned 3 pages. Completing this on the new model with external SSD took only 46 seconds, with that time dropping to 43 seconds using the onboard storage. Using the external hard drive, we saw a familiar slowdown to 73 seconds. Doing this on the 2016 model with external SSD took 61 seconds, amounting to a difference of 33% versus the 2018 model. So certainly an improvement on the 2018, but not as dramatic as what we saw with the PSD and JPEG exports. Now jumping over to Photoshop, I came in with the expectations that the near 3 GB per second read and write speed of the onboard storage would make opening and saving PSD files lightning fast, but sadly my expectations were only short-lived here. Opening a 60 megapixel PSD file with 20 adjustment layers took 7.1 seconds with the external SSD and an identical 7.1 seconds with the onboard storage. We did, however, see a difference using the external hard drive, which increased the time to 10.3 seconds. The same open operation on the 2016 model took 11.6 seconds, which gives us another surprising 63% difference. On the other end of the spectrum, saving the PSD file remained painfully slow in all accounts, taking 35 seconds to save on the 2018 model with external and onboard SSD, and 44 seconds on the external hard drive. The 2016 model gave us a 43% difference, taking 50 seconds to complete. Based on both of these tests, we can see that the storage media performance is really only a factor up until that 400 megabyte per second read and write speed that we get on the external SSD, and beyond that, we don't really get any additional gains. The process of parsing out the file and loading it into memory, and vice versa, results in a CPU bottleneck rather than a constraint on the speed of the storage media. Luckily, the save operation happens in the background, but despite that fact, given that this is a fairly standard file without a massive amount of layers, I was kind of hoping for better performance by this point. Now for the rest of the tests, I'll only be giving the times using the external SSD, since the operations aren't affected by the speed of the storage media, given that the image is already stored into memory as opposed to the disk. Working inside of Photoshop, another common operation is to merge all visible layers into one, which is something that's often done before the initialization of any filters and frequently towards the end of the workflow. For our sample 20 layer 60 megapixel PSD, this took 5.7 seconds on the 2018 model and 10.1 seconds on the 2016, which is a surprising 77% improvement in this case. Next up, I wanted to test out some interpolation processes like upsampling and downsampling, and in particular the Preserve Details 2.0 upsampling algorithm, as that uses the Adobe Sensei AI engine. Typically, AI operations are run on a GPU rather than a CPU, so I was curious whether we would make significant gains with the Vega 20 over the Radeon 460. Upsampling our image to 15,000 pixels on the long edge using Preserve Details 2.0 took 36.6 seconds, and indeed we saw a very large difference on the 2016 model as the time nearly doubled to 72 seconds. To see whether my AI GPU theory was correct, I upsampled once again to 15,000 pixels, but this time using the relatively simple bicubic smoother interpolation, and to my surprise, once again we saw a difference of 90% between the two machines. The new model did it in 11.9 seconds, while the old one took 22.7 seconds. This is surprising given that typically bicubic interpolation happens on the CPU as opposed to the GPU, but despite my research, I'm not able to find any details on the implementation that Photoshop currently uses. A GPU implementation would make sense, as the near twofold difference is simply far too large for the improved CPU alone to explain. Downsampling differences were far less drastic, as reducing our 60 megapixel image with 10 copies of the background layer to 3600 pixels using bicubic smoother took 11.4 seconds on the 2018 model and 15.8 seconds on the 2016, which amounts to only a 39% difference between the two machines. With only a single copy of the background layer, the reduction was nearly instantaneous on both computers, so it made accurate measurements difficult to come by. I did want to test out at least one of the more time-consuming filters, and that is the lens blur filter. At a 50 pixel radius and our 60 megapixel sample image, the times were 12 seconds and 18.3 seconds on the 2018 and 2016 models respectively. This results in another large gain of 53% for the new model. Despite the improved graphics card and CPU, the Select and Mask feature in Photoshop still sadly remains as slow and painful to use as ever. Here we've got a comparison of both machines using Select and Mask with the 2018 model on the left and the 2016 model on the right. On the right we can see that the Quick Select brush is pretty much bordering on unusable, while on the left it is a bit more tolerable but still far from great. The Refine Edge brush was also more responsive on the 2018 model with far less time spent waiting in between brushed areas. As we can see in this example, the best strategy for Select and Mask is to pretty much avoid using it and opt for Quick Select and Refine Edge instead. Using the Quick Select and the Refine Edge works smoothly on both machines with a little difference between them, although the Refine Edge tool still took a bit of time to process the edge selection even on the 2018 model. Rounding out my testing in Photoshop, I tried the Content Aware Fill tool in order to unsuccessfully remove a subject from an image. For this, our new MacBook took a snappy 6.8 seconds, while the older model did so in 7.9 seconds. Surprisingly, our gains here were quite modest, with a mere 16% separating the two machines. So what are my final impressions? Well, from the test that I performed in Photoshop, we got an average gain of 55.5%, while Capture One yielded improvements of 48%. Select and Mask went from completely useless to slightly less useless, and overall operation just felt a tad smoother on the new model, but nothing terribly drastic. If you're planning on investing in a new MacBook and use Capture One Pro a great deal, I do recommend going with the Vega graphics option, as the developers at Phase 1 take great efforts to utilize it whenever possible. Photoshop support for GPU-based algorithms remains questionable, but we can hope that this improves with coming versions. eGPU support in Photoshop is unofficial, while Capture One does support it natively. As a result, I'll try and rerun some of these tests when the new Blackmagic eGPU Pro comes out to see if we observe any differences. The i9 looks to be a good choice for photographers given that it provides better burst speed, and a good deal of our operations are of that nature as opposed to long-running renders. Expanded onboard storage should be treated as a convenience as it yields only minor improvements to I/O operations, and an external SSD is more than sufficient for these tasks. The display of the machine is easy to calibrate and the color is accurate, which has historically been the case with all MacBook Pros. Stability thus far has been good in both Photoshop and Capture One, and backwards compatibility with various Photoshop versions in Mojave hasn't been an issue. If you're an owner of a 2016 or 2017 model, I don't see a great deal of value in upgrading at this time, given that the overall usage on both machines was good. But if you plan on working with very high-resolution files or complex composites, these differences will compound, so you may indeed find the new model a worthwhile upgrade. Similarly, if you're doing a good deal of video work, then other tests have shown significant improvements in those applications. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if so, be sure to like and subscribe so you get future updates just like this one. Bye for now.